test. Hey, how's it going, everybody? Happy Wednesday to you. Going good, going good. Did you get your mandatory COVID test? Going tonight. Was I talking with you guys about this on Monday? I think you were the ones who made me aware. Well, about the COVID testing for all students, yeah. I didn't realize that it was a mandatory thing before you left. Oh, okay, so it must have been somebody else. Yeah. Crazy, right? All right, let's get into it. So we are starting to discuss flight controllers. And we introduced an example of a controller in last class. And that type of controller is called a stability augmentation controller. And what that does is it's something behind the scenes that automatically adjusts the control surfaces on an aircraft to make it behave in a way that you specify. I want to go back to that really quick. Wait, where's this? That's okay, we'll fill it in. Okay, so we looked at this executive business jet. I believe it's called the Jetstar, but it has a short period mode that is really underdamped, and it takes a really long time to settle out. And that's what you're seeing in red right here. This is plotting the pitch angle of the aircraft over time when you excite that short period mode. All right, and so that's just really undesirable to have the nose of the aircraft go up and down, up and down. Looks like it does that once every 3 seconds approximately. And it has an amplitude of like 1 degree in this case. So it's just a bummer, right? So one way that you could make the aircraft behave better and not oscillate so much is you could change the geometry of the aircraft. For example, you could increase the area of the horizontal tail. That's one way to damp out this short period mode based on the geometry of the aircraft. However, we pointed out that even if you do this and you fix the mode for a certain flight condition, the problem is that aircraft have what we call a flight envelope. And here are figures. I mean, take a fighter aircraft, for example. A flight envelope describes all the different conditions that it might fly at for different situations. Like it might be doing a high-speed intercept. It might just be taking off. It might be engaged in air combat or ground combat. But all of these take place at different altitudes and different Mach numbers. And if you specify the geometry of an aircraft to get the dynamics you want for, say, this region of the flight envelope, it might not work well for you in this opposite region of the flight envelope where you're taking off and you're at much lower altitude and have much lower speed. So all that to say, just specifying the geometry of the aircraft, that isn't enough to get the behavior you want in all areas of the flight envelope. So what we do instead, we make a controller. Now a controller can mean different things. For this example, I'm going to make a drawing. I'm going to make a perfect drawing. For this example, what the controller does is it's an automatic system that actuates the elevator up and down. And let's see. So the black line here is the response, which looks much nicer. It damps out much more quickly, less oscillations. This is the response when we have a stability augmentation controller that automatically adjusts the elevator over time. So here, this plot is showing the elevator angle chosen automatically by our controller. It starts at 1 degree, swoops back down to 0.6. So if you were looking out the window, you would see the elevator changing with time. This is an alternative strategy to get the behavior you want. Now you could say, okay, couldn't the pilot just, adjust the stick to damp out these oscillations by his or herself? I guess, but who wants to do that? You don't want to compensate for those annoying dynamics yourself. And sometimes the oscillations are, depending on the aircraft, a short period mode can have faster oscillations, and you might not be able to compensate quickly enough by yourself as a pilot. So it's just better if you have an automatic system to take care of it for you. So different types of stability augmentation controllers, they might control the ailerons to stabilize the roll of the aircraft. You can have the rudder, design a stability augmentation controller for that, so it's automatically going this way or that to stabilize the controller and stabilize the aircraft. So the principle is the same for different control surfaces. So that's what stability augmentation is. It's tapping in to one or more control surfaces on the aircraft so that they automatically make adjustments to make the aircraft fly better. Okay. Now today, we are going to talk about transfer functions for aircraft. Transfer functions are a popular way, they're a popular style of mathematical model for designing controllers. So now that we're designing flight controllers, we have to get into transfer functions a little bit. Now, there's two main schools of control theory. Sometimes they call it traditional methods, or you might also hear traditional methods referred to as frequency domain methods. Wait, I should be a little more clear here. I need like a subheading. So I'm talking about control system design techniques. I mean, today we're talking about transfer functions, but by way of introduction, there's like two main schools of control system design. Number one, traditional methods or frequency domain methods, and transfer functions fall here. I'll just abbreviate it TF. All right, so we're going to cover some of this. And there's also modern methods, which you might call time domain methods. And the mathematical representation we like to use for modern methods is state space models. Now, both of these methods have advantages for different problems. I would say that modern methods using state space techniques for control, they are more popular nowadays. If you're designing a simpler control system, maybe for a one input, one output system, or a single input, single output system, which we call CISO, I think traditional methods are pretty nice for that. Using frequency domain methods, you can pretty quickly develop a controller that gets the job done. State space approaches, that's like bringing out the big guns. That'll also get the job done. All right. One thing about transfer functions that I'm going to point out at the end here. Transfer functions make it easy to assess steady state behavior. What I mean by steady state is the dynamics as time goes to infinity. This is important for control systems because whenever you develop a control system, you have to prove that your control system is stable. This is where it gets dangerous. When you design a control system, especially a digital control system, if you don't dial it in properly, that's where systems go unstable. I think in nature, it's rare to encounter an unstable system, more or less. As engineers, as control engineers, we run into instability more by our own mistakes a little bit when we design a control system that is unstable. All right, so if something goes unstable, then over time, you're going to see that your steady state behavior, whatever you're measuring, it's going to go to infinity mathematically instead of going to the reference position that you would prefer. So when we're designing a control system using traditional methods, using transfer functions, we can use final value theorem to help us assess how our controller behaves at steady state. Well, I'm not necessarily talking about stability here. That's just one piece. Another piece is in control systems, we have what we call steady state error. So what I mean by that is, let's say I'm designing a controller that controls the altitude of the aircraft. And let's say I want to go to 40,000 feet to cruise. So you'll design a controller to get you there. Now what might happen is your controller only brings you here. And there's an error, I don't know, of a couple thousand feet there. This is what we call steady state error for a control system. You run into steady state error like this if you use a proportional control system. We have what are called PI control systems. I mean, probably all of you have heard of like PI, PID controllers. That refers to proportional for the P, integral for the I, derivative for the D. But anyways, the integral portion of your controller helps to reduce steady state error. Excuse me. So, anyways, it's really easy to discover what this error is going to be using final value theorem with the transfer function, and then you can compensate for it. Okay. So all of that is just a little bit of motivation about transfer functions, and then today I'm going to derive or we're going to derive together a transfer function for the short period flight mode, and then we're going to introduce final value theorem to just show how it works with a transfer function. So here we go. Let's just jump right into it. This is the state space model for the short period dynamics of an aircraft. So we've derived this before, but I want to put this in a different form. In our Nelson textbook, maybe I'll show you this first. They like to use the angle of attack as one of the short period states. And so in order to create this state, we have to use these relationships. So in our original model, we don't have the angle of attack as one of the states. We have this velocity with respect to the body Z frame. So what we have to do, we have to substitute in here. This would be my longitudinal speed times my angle of attack. This would be my longitudinal speed times the time derivative of my angle of attack. Using this will be equal to 1 over u times z alpha. Except this u is going to cancel with this when we multiply it out. This u would cancel with this. Or wait. What am I saying? This u would multiply with this. But when we divide by u on this side, then it would cancel with this. Blah, 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 blah. You guys can do that. I'm going to fill in what the result is. We would get this z sub alpha divided by u. We would get a 1 here. We would get a z delta E divided by U. So we're just taking our model, rewriting it in terms of different variables. This is not a big deal. Okay. And we're going to define these. We'll say this is my state vector for the short period mode, so I'll have sub SP there. This will be my A matrix for the short period mode. My state vector. My B matrix. And that'll be U. So using these variables, we can write out this model for the short period mode. Oh, right, I wanted to use these deltas. The reason we're using delta is because these are linearized dynamics. All of these variables should be small perturbations about the reference flight condition. So I just use the deltas to remind us of that. All right. Now, whenever you're designing whenever you're implementing a controller, you're going to have feedback from sensors. So if I want to control these short period dynamics, I need to be sensing these dynamics as well. So we're going to define some sensor outputs, which we'll call Y. And these are going to monitor our short period states. So the way we do this in state space notation, we have our C matrix times our states, and then we also have a D matrix, and that's called the direct transmission matrix, but it's usually 0. And I believe for all of our flight transfer functions, we're going to have it be equal to 0. So it's just going to be the C matrix times our short period states. All right. Now, what should the C matrix be? Well, it depends on what you're measuring and how much you're measuring. Let's assume that we directly measure both states, our angle of attack and our pitch rate. So that means that my measurements are just those two variables. And we put it in a column vector. That's the standard way of doing it. So if you're wondering what the C matrix is, it's going to be some matrix times my states, and, well, if I'm just getting back the states, it must be an identity matrix. So anytime that you're measuring all of your states for your dynamics, the C matrix will be identity of whatever size you need. So let's assume that for this. Okay, so we have our complete state space model. We have the state dynamics equations, and we also have our output equations. All right, let's talk about a transfer function. A transfer function is defined as, here we go. You remember this. The Laplace transform of a system output divided by the Laplace transform of a system input. Now there's one more piece to this definition, and I forgot it earlier as I was writing this out. But do you remember what the last condition is? I mean, this sounds good, but it's not enough to define a transfer function yet. What is this definition missing? Initial ooh, good. What about the initial conditions, Dilly? You've got it. They're not specified. But what should they be specified to? A transfer function is the ratio of the Laplace transform of the system output to the Laplace transform of the system input, where the initial conditions to steady state, I believe. Well, if you mean where the initial conditions of the system states are 0. That's important. And now the definition is complete. Now for flight dynamics, we're going to have systems that have multiple inputs and multiple outputs generally. So what do you do in that case? You don't just have one input and one output. So for a system with multiple inputs and multiple outputs, well, you can define multiple transfer functions. Let's kind of write out a general expression. I like to call, or it's pretty common to use the variable capital G for transfer functions. And notice I have these subscripts I, J, and the the meaning of those will become apparent in a second. So let's say this is my ith output, y of t. So I take the Laplace transform of my ith output, divide by the Laplace transform of my jth input, and this would be yi of s. Actually, I'll write it this way. So taking the Laplace transform of a function of time transforms it into the s domain. So t is the independent variable of the time domain, s is the independent variable of the Laplace domain, and in the Laplace domain, s is a complex number. So this is the ith system output, the jth system input. Okay, so let's bring this to the short period model. We have two outputs and one input, because we're assuming that we have sensors that are going to measure our angle of attack and another sensor that's going to measure our pitch rate. So we have a gyroscope to measure this, some angle of attack sensor here, and then our input is going to be the deflection of the elevator, that angle. So two outputs, one input. So we have two possible transfer functions. So I'll call the first one G11. It's the Laplace transform of my first output divided by my one and only input. So that would be delta alpha of s and delta E of s. That would be our first transfer function. And then the next one, you just take the ratio of your second output to our one and only input. And if you had more inputs, you would just have more of these ratios. All right. So, how do I get these? How do I get these ratios? I want to show you a matrix technique to derive these transfer functions. What I mean by matrix technique is starting from a state space model, which is what we have. You might have seen this before, you might have not, but it is a nifty way. So first, we're going to take the Laplace transform of the output equation. So I used a capital here, but I kind of like using a lowercase better now that I'm getting into it. So our output vector in the Laplace domain is the Laplace transform of our output equation in the time domain. Well, what was our output equation in the time domain? It was our C matrix, which was an identity matrix, times our state vector. Wait, didn't I call these deltas before? I'm getting a little inconsistent with my notation here, you know? Like, I feel like if I'm gonna do deltas, I gotta commit. I gotta keep using them. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. We're going to put deltas everywhere. Okay. So if you take the Laplace transform of this, you're going to get your C matrix times delta x in the S domain. All right, so we're just going to summarize this with this equation. This is our output vector in the Laplace domain as a function of our states in the Laplace domain. So we need an expression for our states in the Laplace domain. How are we going to get that? We're going to take the Laplace transform of our state dynamics equations. So I need a delta in there. All right, so x dot, those are our state dynamics equations. So let's expand that out. We know that's going to be the A matrix times our state vector plus our B matrix times our input. I mean, let's put a vector over this because for this particular problem, the short period mode, there's just one input. It's the elevator angle. But in general, we could have more. So let's just keep this a little general. Okay. Here we go. So let's do this left-hand side. If you take the Laplace transform of this, it's going to be S times delta x of S minus the initial conditions. Whenever you take the Laplace transform of a derivative, you have S times that variable in the S domain minus the initial conditions of that variable in the time domain. And this is where it becomes important that we said, well, a transfer function assumes that the initial conditions are 0. So I'm just going to take this and write a 0 vector there. So it's going to go away. All right, now we're going to do the right-hand side. So we're going to have the A matrix times delta x now in the S domain plus the B matrix times delta u, which is now also in the S domain. So all that I have here on the left-hand side is S times x of S. Now, this is also equal to S times the identity matrix times delta x of S. And you'll see why I want to write it out like that in a second. You can always substitute an identity matrix in there because identity matrix times a vector just returns the vector itself. Dilly asks, how do we know that the initial conditions are 0? So, I mean, generally, if an aircraft's just flying through the sky and you specify some arbitrary time as the initial time, the initial conditions won't be 0, right? I mean, it's how can you guarantee that? Because the aircraft's just moving around doing what it does. The reason the initial conditions are 0 here is because that's the definition of a transfer function. It's looking at the special case where the aircraft is locked in to some steady state condition. And for us, that steady state condition is just going to be level flight, constant altitude, just cruising at constant speed. And that's the basis from which we're deriving these transfer functions. So they're going to tell us how an input affects an output from that steady state condition. So it's just by definition. That's our baseline. Okay. So I'm going to have, what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring this guy over to the left-hand side. So I'm going to have S, now I'm going to use this identity matrix times delta x of S minus A delta x of S. And then that's going to equal the left-hand side stuff. All right. So then these terms on the left-hand side share that delta x in common. So I have Si minus A is B delta U S. All right, remember our goal was to solve for this term, our states. So how am I going to get those? I'm going to multiply both sides of this equation by the inverse of Si minus A. And when I multiply the left-hand side by the inverse of that matrix, it'll give me the identity, because a matrix times its inverse gives you identity. But on this side, I'm going to have the inverse times B times my input vector. And we're going to call this equation 2. And equation 1 was just our output equation. So we're going to substitute equation 2 into equation 1. Put a delta here. So delta y of S is C times delta x of S. And now we know what delta x is. So it's going to be C times Si minus A inverse times B times my input vector. Now here, these terms in front of the input, this is what we'll call G of S, and it's actually, this is generally a matrix. This is our transfer function matrix. Now you remember how I told you if you have a system with multiple outputs, multiple inputs, you have one transfer function to relate each output to each input. This transfer function matrix is going to hold all of those possible transfer functions in one place. Well, in one matrix. So what does it look like? It may not be obvious by looking at the expression up here, but G of S, our transfer function matrix, will be organized in the following way, where individual transfer functions are elements of a matrix. So let's be general here. Let's say I have P outputs. Or wait. Do I want this to be P? Or wait, I want these to be different numbers. Let's make this one M though, because you'll generally have different numbers of outputs and inputs. So both of them shouldn't be P. Let's just say M. I think that's the number or the letter we used before for the number of inputs. So you have P outputs, M inputs, and so this is our G matrix to relate those. And so let's fill some of this in. The top left element of this transfer function matrix will be y1 of S over u1 of S. And you could call this G11 of S. And then if you go all the way across here, you would have the transfer function that relates our first output to our mth. That's a weird one to say, but our mth input. And then if you go to the second row, you'd have your second input related to your second output related to your first input, and you go all the way across, and you have your second output related to your mth input. You go all the way down, and here we're going to have our pth output. This should be our first input. Blah, 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 blah. And then we're going to have P over M here. So it's a matrix filled up with transfer functions. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to build this transfer function matrix for the short period mode of an aircraft. Prepare yourself. We're going to illustrate this. We're going to see what this looks like exactly. So our short period mode, if we're measuring both of our states, this is going to be our C matrix. So we're going to measure the angle of attack, and we're going to measure the pitch rate with a gyroscope. We're going to measure, well, actually, we're not measuring this. This is our A matrix. This is our B matrix. All right, so we have an expression for the transfer function matrix. It's this. G of S is C. Here's our A matrix, here's our B matrix, but we have to do this SI minus A inverse, and that's the pain. We'll do it once by hand. What is SI minus A? Let's try see if I can get both of them on here. Here's our A matrix up here. So we're going to have the minus of the A matrix. How about I just put that like in here first? So the minus of the top left element, the minus of the top right, the minus of the bottom left, M alpha dot Z alpha over U star, and the minus of the bottom right element, MQ plus M alpha dot. What does S times the identity matrix look like? Well, it's just S00S. So I'm going to have that minus the A matrix. So basically it's just going to look like an S here and an S minus this down here. And then for the other ones, it's just 0 minus that stuff. So we could just leave it out. I'll scoot this over. All right, so that's SI minus A. And then we have to take the inverse of that. So this is how you take the inverse of a 2 by 2. What you do is first thing you do is you switch the top left and the bottom right elements. So the bottom right comes up here to the top left. And then the top left, it's going to go to the bottom right. See you later. And then for the top right and top left elements, you just change the sign. So the -1 becomes a +1, and this bottom left, it used to be a negative, but we'll make it a positive now. And then you divide that matrix by the determinant of the original matrix. So the determinant is the product of these pink circled elements. Okay, got that. And then we subtract the product of the green elements. So when I multiply the green elements, they have a minus, that cancels and makes a plus. And so now overall I'm going to have a minus. And if you have a larger matrix, you're not going to do this by hand. You are absolutely not. Okay, so if I want the transfer function matrix, I have to take C, which is an identity matrix. So actually, because this is identity, it's just, we can ignore it because it'll leave the rest of this matrix unchanged. So we're going to take this matrix, SI minus A inverse, and we're going to multiply it by B. So here's SI minus A inverse, and here's B. So at this point, I'm just going to kind of show you. I don't think it would be the best use of time for us to just grind through the rest of this, but let's see. So right here, so I have these two matrices that I have to multiply together. So right here, I just multiplied those together. It was a 2 by 2 times a 2 by 1. So that's why this matrix is a 2 by 1. And fortunately, some things cancel out, like this m alpha dot z delta e over u. Well, it'll cancel with this m alpha dot times z delta e over u. Same sort of thing happens here. And even in the denominator, when we multiply out this determinant, some things cancel. So if we kind of reorganize this, this matrix, which even though there's a lot here, it's only a 2 by 1, and this is our transfer function matrix. So this top element, G11, is the ratio of our first output, which is the angle of attack, over the elevator angle. And the 2-1 element is the ratio of our pitch rate in the Laplace domain to the elevator angle in the Laplace domain. So it's a matrix of transfer functions. So we have two outputs, one input. So this is a 2 by 1. It contains two transfer functions in there. Notice the denominator of the transfer functions is going to be the same. And that's the case for every transfer function matrix. The denominator of every transfer function within a transfer function matrix will be the same. Do you guys remember what the denominator of a transfer function signifies? Oh, you better remember. Or you're not going to get anything for Christmas. Well, okay, I mean, okay, I see what you're saying. That's not what I'm looking for, though. I see what you're saying. Like, the denominator is, because the transfer function is the ratio of the output to the input. LT says, I want bonus points for Christmas. Not if you don't get this. Okay, Miracle says the poles. Miracle, you are so very, very close. Okay, what equation do the poles come from? You're right, though. You get the poles from the denominator of your transfer function, but What is the name of the equation that the poles of a system come from? Characteristic equation. Dilly. Redemption. This is the characteristic equation of the short period mode. Yeah, when you set the denominator equal to 0, that is the characteristic equation. For short period mode. Yes. Are all the memories from dynamic systems coming back? So you can assess the stability of a system from the transfer function. You solve for the roots of the denominator. If they all have a negative real part, then the system is stable. All right, so that's a transient characteristic of the system. The denominator also tells you the system settling time, the natural frequency, all of that good stuff that you want to know. But now, I want to introduce to you how this is useful for steady state analysis. We're going to talk about the final value theorem. Okay, what if... Okay. So what if I want to answer this question? For an elevator angle input of 1 degree, what will my steady state angle of attack be? You could answer this question by running a simulation in the time domain in MATLAB. But there's a faster way, my friend. It's using a transfer function, if you have it, in combination with the final value theorem. All right. Let's answer this. The final value theorem. So here's what the final value theorem says. Here's its definition. And we'll use it with the angle of attack. So the final value of the angle of attack is the limit of the angle of attack as time goes to infinity. So I introduce an elevator angle of 1 degree. Where is that going to take my angle of attack over time? Okay, so that's the final value. So the final value theorem says that this final value is equal to the limit as s approaches 0. So now we're talking Laplace domain. S times my angle of attack in the S domain. Now here's where the transfer function comes in, because, like, let's say from above, we have an expression for G11 of S. How we can use the transfer function is alpha of S is equal to G11 of S times my input. Because remember, this was defined as this ratio anyways. So if I multiply this by this, you know, basically I would have the angle of attack left over. So what we're going to do, we're going to say that I know my angle of attack in the Laplace domain is equal to my transfer function times whatever my elevator angle is in the Laplace domain. Now, if my elevator angle is just a step input set to 1 degree, let's do this. Let's say this is what my elevator input is over time. Boom. 1 degree. And that would be in radians. Pi over 180 radians. Because when we use this expression with our equations, we're going to have to make sure it's in radians, okay? If you convert this into the Laplace domain, if you take a step input like this, or a step input is also called a heaviside function. This is a step input or heaviside. I think it's somebody's last name. How would you like that if that was your last name? Okay, let's say it's pi over 180 radians. Then, if we transform that into the Laplace domain, so I'm taking the Laplace domain, the Laplace transform of this heaviside function, it's going to be pi over 180, because that's the amplitude here, times 1 over s. So anytime you take the Laplace transform of a step function, this is its Laplace domain counterpart. So let's make that substitution. So s times my transfer function times my input, which I know is 1 degree times 1 over s. Ooh, and beautiful. Now that I'm using this step input that has an s in the denominator, those s's are going to cancel. So to get the final value of my angle of attack, I'm going to have to look at this transfer function and just look at what happens to it as s goes to 0. Let's look at this transfer function because we have it up above. Here it is. It's this one. So all we need to do is set s equal to 0. So this term, goodbye. This term, goodbye. This term, adios. And we're just going to have this term divided by this term. All right, let's write it. So we're taking the limit as s goes to 0, and all that's left in that transfer function is this. Z delta E over U star times M sub Q divided by that term in the denominator minus M alpha. And then we just can't forget this term out here. Now the beautiful thing about this is we know that we can look up these terms for typical aircraft from a table. So we just plug in these numbers, we multiply it by pi over 180, and boom, it just gives us a number, which I don't know what it is, because we just have this equation expression right now. But it doesn't require any simulation. It's an algebraic relationship. Now, how we're going to use this final value theorem for control system design is, instead of saying that the elevator angle is just going to be a predefined step input or whatever, we're going to define more complicated functions. And one of our goals will be to define this function so that our steady state error goes to 0. So let's say like there's an angle of attack that I want to get to. Like maybe I know I want to start increasing altitude at a certain rate, and I know that a certain angle of attack is going to start putting me on that trajectory. So I might say that I have a reference angle of attack. Now we could define an error, which is the difference between my actual angle of attack and this reference. Now, if we design a good controller, a controller that does its job and brings us to the reference, then we know the limit as time goes to infinity of this error, it should be 0. All right? So we can use this final value theorem as a design tool where we know in advance I want this to be true. And usually to make this true, you need to add an integrator to your control system. But we'll get more into that. Okay, let's recap here. Okay, because our goal of today was to just get to the point where we know how to get transfer functions given a state space model. So we already have state space models like this for each of our flight modes. We have the short period, that's the one we worked on today. We have the long period or phugoid mode. We have the Dutch roll. We have the spiral mode. We have the roll mode. All of them have a time domain representation that we've derived. All right. To get a transfer function, first you define like an output equation. If you're measuring all of those system states, then your C matrix is going to be identity. And then your transfer function matrix, where'd you go? It's this. All right. So if you have your C matrix, your A matrix, your B matrix, you can derive the transfer function matrix. And that's what we did for the short period today. And each element of your transfer function matrix is a transfer function. It's like one of those Russian dolls where you open it up and there's more inside. So the top left element will be the transfer function of your first output to your first input. Okay, and then final value theorem. We're going to use this in control system design to guarantee that we have 0 steady state error when we make a controller. And guys, that's it. That's it for today. You are now transfer function experts. So now that we know how to make transfer functions, now we're gonna get into some controller design. It's gonna be a good time. This is where the payoff comes. I think control systems is the payoff of studying dynamics. Let's see, tonight. Tonight. I had a question about the homework grading. Yes, what's your question? Oh, Saeed has office hours tonight. I have office hours tomorrow. I always forget. Epic. That's right. It's epic miracle. It's epic. Ooh. Okay, for the last assignment that was graded, I did the partials correctly. I just plugged in the wrong numbers into my partials from the equilibrium points, and they took off 12 points for the whole homework for one error. Is there any carry-through error? Because I think that was the only mistake I made. You did the partials correctly, you just plugged in the wrong numbers into your partials from the equilibrium points. Let's see here. Is that assignment 7? Like I took the values I had for x2 and accidentally plugged it in for x1. 7, okay, let me... I see. Okay, Dilly, send me an email. And what I'm gonna do is I'll review that. Like I'll look at that in detail. Sound good? Okay. Thank you very much. Do you guys have any other like homework questions? You have a homework due Friday, correct? Assignment number 10. Yeah, it's due the 20th. It's due Friday. We're looking at increased altitude and how it affects the Dutch roll response. Increased speed on the short period response. Ooh, there's our short period model from today. We can use OD45 to simulate these, right? Yes. Crispy brownies, you are correct. For question 1, do we use V from the first chart as U naught? Well, you're going to use... Yes, it'll be the velocity. So you're going to have... The way to get the speed is you're going to know the Mach number and the altitude. And then, because the Mach number is the speed of the aircraft divided by the speed of sound at altitude. So you have to look up the speed of sound at each of these altitudes, and then you calculate the speed from this. And then that speed, that velocity is going to be equal to U naught. Oh, yeah, they give you, I guess they already do that. You're right, in the table. So you're right, Paige. This V is just going to be U naught. You're right. We're close to the end, everybody. I hope you're looking forward to some Thanksgiving break. It'll be a nice break. I love Thanksgiving too. I love Thanksgiving too. Very underrated. Underrated, right, guys? Stuffing, that's the jam. Man, I had a roommate. His name was Michael. He made stuffing. He was the master. Sucks it's so close to Christmas because it gets overshadowed. I don't know if I look at it that way. Okay, sure, I agree. It gets overshadowed a little bit. But it's pretty sweet that they're like just a couple weeks apart. Because you're like, oh man, Thanksgiving's over. But then you're like, wait a minute. Christmas is just around the corner. So you still feel pretty good. Let me ask you guys this. And be honest. Have you started listening to Christmas music yet? Crispy Brownie says Black Friday kind of takes away from things. Dude, forget Black Friday. Forget Black Friday. Don't do Black Friday. Do you guys do Black Friday? In my family, we make so much food that Thanksgiving doesn't end for a few days. Hey, that sounds like the way to do it. Yeah, there's always leftovers for days. Same with Christmas. What do you mean Black Friday takes away from Thanksgiving? What are you talking about? What the heck are you talking about? Dilly says no Christmas music yet. Are you being honest though? No Christmas music until Black Friday, no exceptions. There you go. If I'm perfectly honest, I've listened to a little bit. You heard it on the radio already? And not just on one channel, a couple. Wow. I'm surprised by that. You know what I'm also surprised by? Somebody across the street from me already has the full Christmas fixings on the lawn. There's a full nativity scene. There's like a snowman and there's lights. In my opinion, it's just my opinion, that's a little too early. It's okay if you listen to Christmas music. You get in the holiday spirit a little bit, but you can't be putting out the sheep, baby in the manger, the snowman, not yet, the reindeer, no. But here's the question from Dilly. I can't wait. What is this question? I want Thanksgiving music. It would just be people talking about food. That's good. Is too early worse than people who leave their lights up till February? Okay. I still think that's more acceptable. That's my opinion on that. You know what though? I think COVID has something to do with it, because the same thing at Halloween. People put up Halloween decorations like a month early. So why should we expect any different for Christmas? And that's okay. Snoop Dogg's You Name It's Holiday Anthem. Check it out, Dilly. Snoop Dogg has a couple holiday albums, right? I know I've listened to a Christmas album by him before. Oh my goodness. Don't look it up. Good grief, Snoop. I mean, I love Snoop, but what are you doing? That's a Thanksgiving song. All right, everybody. It's been a pleasure. I'm going to head out. See you very soon.